Money doesn't reveal who you are. It exposes what you've been hiding all along. The words hung in the air like a quiet challenge as Ethan Cole stood at the head of the long glass table, the Manhattan skyline glowing behind him in soft gold light, for black credit cards lined up in front of him, sleek, heavy, limitless, each one reflecting the faces of the women seated across from him. Vanessa Reed leaned forward first, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she smiled with practiced confidence. Chloe Bennett adjusted her phone subtly under the table, already imagining the content she could create. Rachel Stone sat upright, calculating, composed, eyes sharp with quiet ambition. And then there was Lily Carter, standing slightly behind them, hands folded in front of her uniform, invisible in a room that never made space for people like her, her dark skin almost blending into the shadowed corner near the wall, as if she had been placed there on purpose, unnoticed, uninvited, and yet, somehow, she was part of this moment too, even if no one had said her name yet. Ethan's gaze moved slowly from one woman to the next, unreadable, controlled, like a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. "Each of you gets one," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, sliding the first card toward Vanessa, then Chloe, then Rachel, each movement precise, deliberate, like a ritual. And then, just when it seemed the distribution was complete, his hand paused on the final card, the room shifting almost imperceptibly as eyes followed the motion, curiosity flickering. And then he turned, not to the table, but to the corner. "You too," he said, placing the last black card directly into Lily's hand, the weight of it surprising her, her fingers instinctively tightening around the metal edge as if it might disappear. A quiet ripple passed through the room, subtle, but sharp enough to cut. Vanessa's smile faltered for half a second. Chloe blinked. Rachel's brows drew together, and somewhere behind them, a voice, low but clear enough to be heard, muttered, "People like her don't need black cards." The words landed harder than anyone acknowledged, hanging in the air with a sting that didn't belong in a room this polished. But Ethan didn't react, not outwardly. He simply stepped back, hands clasped behind him, observing, measuring, no rules. He continued, as if nothing had been said. "No limits, spend it however you want. No explanations, I just want to see what you do." The simplicity of it made it more dangerous, more revealing, because there were no boundaries to hide behind, no guidelines to follow, just choice, pure and unfiltered. Vanessa let out a soft laugh, already reaching for her card. "So this is a game?" she asked lightly. "Call it whatever you want," Ethan replied, his eyes never leaving them. Chloe was already typing, her fingers moving fast as she whispered something about exclusive access and brand partnerships. Rachel leaned back slightly, calculating percentages, investments, opportunities, her mind already turning the card into something more, something bigger. But Lily didn't move. She stood there, the card still in her hand, its black surface reflecting her face back at her, distorted by the light. Her reflection caught between who she was and what this moment could make her. She had never held anything like this before, never been given something without conditions, without expectations, and yet the room around her felt heavier now, filled with eyes that didn't see her, only what they assumed about her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, pressing in, silent but suffocating, as if the card in her hand didn't belong to her at all, as if it was a mistake waiting to be corrected. Ethan noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything, the hesitation, the stillness, the way her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the card instead of gripping it fully, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to hold it. And for a brief moment, something shifted in his expression, something almost human, almost curious, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by the same controlled detachment. "You have 48 hours, he added, glancing at his watch, the soft tick of time suddenly louder in the quiet room. "After that, we meet again, and we see what you've done." Vanessa stood first, confident, energized, already picturing the boutiques she would visit, the statements she would make. Chloe followed, her mind racing with angles, captions, impressions. Rachel nodded once, already planning her strategy, and then, slowly, almost as an afterthought, Lily stepped back, the card still in her hand, her presence fading again as the others moved toward the door. their voices filling the space she left behind. But just before she disappeared completely, she glanced down at the card one more time, her reflection staring back at her, quiet, uncertain, and somewhere deep inside, a question began to form, not about what she could buy, but about what she should. And across the room, Ethan Cole watched her go, his jaw tightening just slightly, because for the first time since the test began, he wasn't sure what the outcome would be, and that uncertainty, that was exactly what he had been looking for. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing the four women into separate reflections of the same opportunity, but by the time they reached the ground floor, their worlds had already begun to split. Vanessa stepped out first, heels clicking sharply against polished marble, her voice already on the phone, laughing, making reservations. "Clear my schedule tonight. I want something unforgettable." While Chloe lingered just long enough to angle her phone toward the mirrored wall, snapping a quick shot of the black card between her fingers, her caption already forming in her mind. Something about power, something about access, something that would make people watch. Rachel exited quietly, no phone, no performance, just a slight tightening of her grip on the card as she calculated risk versus return, percentages stacking neatly in her head. But Lily remained in the elevator a moment longer, alone now, the silence pressing in as the numbers blinked above the door, her reflection staring back at her again, smaller this time, more uncertain, the card still resting in her palm like it did not belong there. When the doors finally opened, she stepped out slowly, the noise of the lobby rushing back in, people moving, voices overlapping, none of them noticing her, just the way it always was, and yet everything felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had changed around her. She moved toward the service corridor out of habit, her steps quiet, measured, the card slipping into the pocket of her uniform as if hiding it might make it safer, or perhaps make her feel safer, because the moment she placed it out of sight, the whispers from upstairs seemed to echo louder in her mind. People like her. The words repeating, sticking, shaping the edges of her thoughts in a way she could not easily shake. Upstairs in a room lined with glass and steel, Ethan Cole stood alone, watching the city stretch endlessly beyond the windows, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, his reflection faint against the skyline. Behind him, a wall of monitors flickered to life one by one, each screen pulling data in real time, transactions waiting to be written, decisions waiting to be made. He did not sit, he did not rush, he simply waited, because in his experience, people never hesitated long when given unlimited access, not when the only rule was that there were no rules. And right on cue, the first notification appeared. Vanessa Reed, high-end boutique, Upper East Side, $5,000. Then another, 10,000. Then another, the pattern forming quickly, predictable, almost boring. Ethan's expression did not change. He had seen this before, not just once, but enough times to know exactly how it would unfold. Chloe Bennett followed not long after, multiple smaller transactions, digital, strategic, marketing tools, influencer placements, the kind of spending designed to multiply itself, clever, but still expected. Rachel Stone was slower, but when her activity appeared, it was precise, investment transfers, calculated, controlled. She was not wasting the opportunity, but she was not revealing anything new either. Ethan exhaled quietly, his fingers tapping once against the chair. 3 cards, 3 stories he already understood. And then there was the fourth, Lily Carter, still blank, no activity, no movement, nothing but silence. His gaze lingered on the empty column longer than necessary, not because it surprised him, but because it unsettled him in a way he did not immediately recognize. Downstairs, Lily moved through her routine like she always did, clearing tables, refilling glasses, keeping her eyes low, her presence unnoticed, but every now and then, her hand would brush against her pocket, feeling the shape of the card, reminding her it was still there, still real. And with each passing minute, the question grew louder, not about what she could buy, but about what it meant that she could buy anything at all. During her break, she stepped outside, the late afternoon air cool against her skin, the city stretching around her in every direction, loud, alive, indifferent. She sat on a bench near the corner, watching people pass, watching the way they carried themselves, confident, certain, as if the world had already made space for them. She pulled the card out slowly, turning it between her fingers, the black surface catching the fading light. For a moment, she imagined walking into one of those stores Vanessa had already entered, imagined the looks, the questions, the doubt. And then she imagined something else, something quieter, something that did not fit the image the card seemed to demand. And that was the moment the conflict settled deeper inside her, not as temptation, but as responsibility. Back upstairs, another notification chimed. Ethan glanced at the screen automatically, but it was not Lily. Not yet. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms now, his mind drifting, not to the women downstairs, but to a memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. A dinner, years ago, a different table, a different woman, laughter that had sounded real until it was not, until the truth revealed itself in numbers, in transactions, in choices that could not be undone. He had learned something that night, something simple, something sharp, that people do not lie with their words nearly as much as they lie with their spending. And since then, he had trusted patterns more than promises, numbers more than emotions. But now, as he looked at the fourth column, still empty, still waiting, he felt something unfamiliar press against that certainty. Not doubt exactly, but curiosity, the kind that does not come from expecting a result, but from not knowing what the result will be. And as the sun dipped lower behind the skyline, casting the room in a softer, dimmer light, Ethan Cole found himself watching that empty space more closely than any of the others, because in a test designed to reveal everything, the only thing that truly stood out was the one person who had not revealed anything at all. By the time night settled over the city, the differences between them had already started to sharpen into something visible, something undeniable. Vanessa stepped out of a black SUV in front of a flagship boutique on Fifth Avenue, the kind with glass doors that opened before you even touched them, her laughter spilling out into the cool air as she walked inside like she owned the place, the black card flashing between her fingers, not as a tool, but as a statement. Within minutes, racks of designer pieces surrounded her, silk, leather, diamonds, each item chosen not because she needed it, but because she could. Because the limit had been removed, and without limits, she felt more like herself than ever. Across town, Chloe stood under a ring light in her apartment, the skyline behind her carefully framed, the black card held just close enough to the camera to spark curiosity without revealing too much. Sometimes opportunities come when you least expect them, she said with a smile that had been practiced more times than it had been felt, her followers responding instantly. Comments flooding in, speculation rising. She spent quickly, but not carelessly, subscriptions, promotions, visibility. Every dollar aimed at turning this moment into something that could last longer than 48 hours. Rachel, on the other hand, sat alone at her desk, a single lamp casting a clean white circle of light. Her laptop open, spreadsheets already forming. She entered numbers with precision, moving funds, testing limits, mapping out returns. For her, this was not about indulgence or attention. It was about leverage, about taking something temporary and making it permanent. Her card moved quietly, efficiently, leaving behind no spectacle, just strategy. And then there was Lily, walking home under the dim glow of streetlights, the city quieter now, but still alive in the distance, her footsteps steady against the sidewalk, the card still resting in her pocket, untouched. Every now and then her hand would drift toward it, not to take it out, but just to feel it, to remind herself that it was still there, that this was not some strange dream she would wake up from. She passed storefronts glowing with warm light, people inside laughing, dining, living lives that seemed far removed from hers, and for a brief moment, the thought crossed her mind again. She could walk in, she could buy something, anything, no questions asked, no limits. But the thought did not settle. It passed through her like a breeze, leaving behind something heavier, something quieter. By the time she reached her apartment building, the night had deepened, the hallway lights flickering faintly as she climbed the stairs, each step echoing softly. Inside her small apartment, everything was exactly as she had left it, simple, worn, familiar. She set her keys down, slipped off her shoes, and finally took the card out of her pocket. Placing it carefully on the table, it looked out of place there, too sleek, too perfect against The surface of something so ordinary. She sat down across from it, her elbows resting lightly on her knees, her eyes fixed on the black surface as if it might speak, as if it might tell her what she was supposed to do. But it said nothing. It just reflected her back at herself, quiet, steady, real. Hours passed, the city outside dimming further, her apartment growing still, but Lily did not move much. She thought about everything she could do with it, the rent she could cover, the things she had gone without, the life she could step into. And yet every option felt incomplete, like it solved something on the surface, but left something deeper untouched, somewhere across the city. In a hospital room she had passed countless times without entering. A man lay staring at a ceiling he could not afford to leave, his future measured in bills he could not pay. Lily did not know his name yet, did not know his story, but the idea of him, of someone like him, began to take shape in her mind. Not as a person, but as a possibility. And that possibility began to pull at her more strongly than any store window ever had. Back in the tower, Ethan remained where he had been, the room now darker, lit mostly by the glow of the screens behind him. The data continuing to stream in, Vanessa's spending escalating, Chloe's engagement rising, Rachel's investment stabilizing. Everything unfolding exactly as expected, except for one thing. He stepped closer to the monitors, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused again on Lily's column. Still nothing. Still empty. He checked the time. Hours had passed. Enough time for hesitation to turn into action. But she had not moved. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the console, not in impatience, but in thought, because this was not a delay he understood. Most people, when given power, rush to use it, to prove something, to themselves or to others. But Lily was doing something different, something slower, something that did not fit the pattern, and patterns, in Ethan's world, were everything. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he considered the possibility that this was not hesitation at all, but choice. And if it was choice, then the question was not when she would use the card, but why she had not yet. And as that thought settled in, something shifted, not in the room, not in the screens, but in him, a small crack in a certainty he had carried for years. Because for the first time since the test began, the most interesting story was not the one being written in numbers and transactions, but the one that had not been written at all, and somewhere across the city. In a quiet apartment where the black card rested untouched on a simple table, Lily Carter sat in silence, staring at a choice that was not about money, but about who she would be when no one was watching, and that choice was getting closer. The city woke up before the sun fully claimed the sky, and with it came the quiet hum of decisions turning into consequences. Vanessa was already stepping out of her penthouse suite in a new coat that still held the crisp scent of untouched fabric, her reflection in the elevator mirror flawless, satisfied, as if the card had simply confirmed what she already believed about herself, that she belonged in places where price tags did not matter. Chloe, on the other hand, had not slept much, her phone still glowing beside her as notifications climbed through the night. Her strategy working, her name spreading, her audience growing. Each dollar spent turning into attention, into validation, into something she could measure. Rachel was up early too, coffee in hand, reviewing her projections, her screen filled with numbers that told a story she trusted, steady growth, controlled risk, everything in its place, everything making sense. But across the city, Lily Carter stood in front of a small bathroom mirror, the light above it flickering slightly as she adjusted the collar of her uniform, her eyes lingering on her own reflection longer than usual, not because something had changed, but because something inside her had shifted. The card was still on the table behind her, exactly where she had left it, untouched, waiting. She turned away from the mirror, walking back into the small room, her gaze drawn to it again. The same quiet pull from the night before, but this time, it felt different, less like a question, more like a direction. She picked it up slowly, the cool surface grounding her, steady, real, and for the first time since she had received it, she did not hesitate. She slipped it into her pocket and stepped out the door, the morning air crisp as it met her face, the city already moving around her, people rushing, cars passing, life continuing. But Lily's steps were different now, not faster, not louder, just more certain. She did not turn toward the subway, not toward the building where she worked. Instead, she walked in the opposite direction, toward a place she had only ever passed, never entered, a hospital on the corner of a busy street. Its glass doors sliding open as people moved in and out, the smell of antiseptic and quiet urgency filling the air inside. She paused just inside the entrance, taking in the space, the sounds, the weight of it. This was not a place people came by choice. This was where life shifted, where things were decided that could not be undone. She stepped further in, her eyes scanning until they landed on a small desk near the waiting area. A woman behind it looking up with practiced patience. "Can I help you?" she asked. Lily nodded once, her voice soft but steady. "I need to pay a bill," she said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anyone in the room could see. Upstairs, in the tower, Ethan Cole stood with a cup of coffee in his hand, untouched, his attention fixed on the screens in front of him. The data from the night still fresh, still unfolding. Vanessa's total climbing, Chloe's engagement metrics rising, Rachel's investments stabilizing further, everything predictable. Everything exactly as expected, until the sound came. A single notification, sharp, clear, different. His eyes moved immediately to the fourth column. Lily Carter, the name now no longer attached to empty space, but to movement, real movement. His fingers tightened slightly around the cup as he leaned in, reading the transaction once, then again, the amount significant, the location unexpected, not a store, not a brand, not an investment platform, but a hospital, a direct payment, full coverage of an outstanding medical bill, anonymous, no notes, no identifiers, just a decision made and executed without hesitation. Ethan's breath slowed, his mind trying to fit the action into a pattern that made sense, but it did not. It did not align with anything he had seen before. He pulled up the details, scrolling, searching for context, for explanation, but there was none, just the transaction, clean, complete, final, and for the first time since he had started this test, Ethan Cole felt something he had not planned for, not disappointment, not confirmation, but disruption, because this was not what the card was meant to reveal, and yet somehow, it revealed more than anything else. Back at the hospital, Lily stood at the desk as the woman processed the payment, her fingers moving across the keyboard, her expression shifting slightly as the amount cleared. Surprise flickering for just a moment before returning to professionalism. "It is done," she said, looking up. "Are you sure you do not want to leave a name?" Lily shook her head gently, her gaze steady. "No, that is okay," she replied, because this was not about being seen, not about being recognized. It was about something quieter, something that did not need a name attached to it. She stepped back, the weight she had been carrying since the moment she received the card lifting in a way she had not expected, not because the money was gone, but because the choice had been made. And for the first time in 48 hours, she felt certain, not about the outcome, not about what would happen next, but about who she had been in that moment. And as she walked back out into the city, the noise returning, the world continuing, Lily Carter no longer felt invisible, not because anyone had noticed her, but because she had finally noticed herself, and far above her, in a room filled with glass and light, Ethan Cole stood very still, staring at a screen that had just changed everything he thought he knew about people, and for the first time in a long time, he did not know what he would say when he saw her again. The moment the transaction cleared, the ripple began, not loud, not immediate, but quiet and precise, like something shifting beneath the surface before anyone could fully see it. Ethan Cole did not move for several seconds after reading the hospital payment, his eyes fixed on the screen, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more familiar, something easier to categorize, but they did not. They remained exactly as they were, clean, deliberate, final, and that was what unsettled him most, because there was no performance attached to it, no secondary action, no follow-up transaction that tried to turn it into something else. It was not part of a strategy. It was not a statement. It was simply a choice, and choices like that did not fit into the system he had built his understanding around. He set the coffee cup down slowly, untouched, his fingers resting briefly against the edge of the console before he straightened, his posture shifting from passive observation to something more focused, more intentional. He pulled up additional data, referencing the hospital, the account, the bill itself, But every layer he uncovered only confirmed the same thing. There was no connection, no hidden benefit, no return, just a stranger whose burden had disappeared overnight without explanation. And somewhere in that absence of reason, Ethan felt a quiet pressure begin to build, not doubt exactly, but the realization that his test had just revealed something he had not anticipated. Downstairs, the lobby was already filling with morning traffic. Employees moving in and out, conversations overlapping, energy rising. Vanessa arrived first, her presence impossible to ignore, dressed in pieces that had not existed in her closet 24 hours ago, each one chosen to be seen, to be noticed. She walked through the space like it belonged to her, the black card now just another accessory in a collection of proof. Chloe followed shortly after, her phone in hand, her expression carefully curated between excitement and control. She was tracking numbers in real time, engagement, growth, reactions, everything feeding into a narrative she was building around herself. Rachel entered without drawing attention, her movements efficient, her focus already on the next step, the next calculation, the next decision, each of them carrying the results of their choices in visible ways, in confidence, in posture, in expectation. And then Lily arrived, quietly, as she always did, her uniform unchanged, her steps steady, nothing about her appearance suggested anything had shifted, nothing marked her as someone who had just made a decision that would stand out above all the others. She moved through the lobby without interruption, without acknowledgement, just another figure passing through a space that rarely noticed her. But inside, something had changed, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that settled deeper, quieter, more permanent. She no longer felt the weight of the card in her pocket because it was no longer there, and with it gone. The question that had followed her since the moment she received it had also disappeared, replaced by a sense of clarity she had not expected to find. Upstairs, Ethan turned away from the screens for the first time since the transaction appeared, walking slowly toward the window, the city stretching out before him, vast, complex, full of patterns he had spent years learning to read. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was not looking at it as something predictable, something controllable. He was looking at it as something that could still surprise him, his reflection faint in the glass, his expression unreadable, but his thoughts no longer aligned with the certainty he had started with, because the test was no longer unfolding the way it was supposed to. It was no longer confirming his beliefs, it was challenging them, and that was not something he was used to allowing. He turned back toward the room, his gaze shifting once more to the monitors, to the 4 columns that now told 4 completely different stories. 3 of them clear, defined, easy to understand, and one that refused to fit, refused to be simplified. And that was the one that held his attention now, not because it was louder, but because it was quieter, because it had done something the others had not. It had made him pause. And in Ethan Cole's world, pause was rare, meaningful, dangerous even, because it meant something was not aligning the way it should. And as he stood there, watching the data settle into place, he made a decision of his own. Not about the outcome of the test, but about what came next, because for the first time, he was not interested in who had passed. He was interested in why one of them had chosen differently. And across the building, unaware of the shift she had created, Lily Carter stepped into her role for the day, moving through tasks, conversations, responsibilities, her actions steady, her presence quiet, but somewhere in the space between who she had been yesterday and who she was now, a line had been crossed. Not one that anyone else could see, but one that would soon become impossible to ignore, because the test was no longer just about money, and Ethan Cole was beginning to realize that he was not the only one being changed by it. By midday, the building had settled into its usual rhythm, the quiet efficiency of power moving through glass corridors and polished floors. But beneath that surface, something had begun to shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a change in temperature you only notice after it has already happened. Vanessa stood near the center of the executive lounge, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention without seeming like she was trying. Her new purchases already part of her identity, woven seamlessly into the way she held herself, the way she spoke. She laughed lightly as she described her evening, mentioning names, places, experiences that turned heads and invited admiration. Chloe joined in from the side, her tone slightly different, more calculated, less about what she had and more about how it was being seen. Her phone never far from her hand as she showed snippets of her rising metrics. Her audience responding, her influence expanding, each word she spoke layered with intention. Rachel remained closer to the edge of the room, engaged in quieter conversations, her approach less visible but no less effective. She spoke of opportunities, of long-term positioning, her voice steady, confident, grounded in logic rather than display, each of them moving through the space with a sense of ownership, as if the test had already validated something they believed about themselves. And yet, as their voices filled the room, another presence moved quietly along the perimeter, almost unnoticed. Lily Carter carried a tray of glasses from one side of the room to the other, her steps measured, her gaze focused on the task in front of her, but the air around her felt different now, not because anyone had changed the way they looked at her, but because she had changed the way she carried herself. There was a stillness in her movements that had not been there before, a quiet certainty that did not need to be seen to exist, and even though no one acknowledged it directly, it created a subtle contrast, a difference that could be felt even if it was not fully understood. Careful, Vanessa said suddenly as Lily passed by, her tone light, but edged with something sharper. Some things are worth more than what you are used to handling. The comment landed softly, wrapped in politeness, but its meaning was clear. Chloe glanced over briefly, a small smirk touching her lips before she returned to her screen. Rachel said nothing, but her eyes flicked toward Lily for a moment longer than necessary, as if observing something she could not quite define. Lily paused just long enough to steady the tray, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when she responded. "I will be careful," she said simply, and then she moved on, leaving the moment behind without carrying it further, but the words lingered in the space, hanging there, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, because above them, behind a wall of glass, Ethan Cole stood watching, not the room as a whole, but the details within it, the interactions, the pauses, the way people revealed themselves not just through their choices, but through how they treated others when they thought it did not matter. He had shifted his focus now, no longer just tracking transactions, but observing behavior, because the data had already told him what each of them valued. But behavior told him who they were. And as his gaze followed Lily across the room, he noticed something that did not align with his expectations, not just what she had done with the card, but how she carried herself afterward. There was no sign of pride, no need for acknowledgement, no shift in her actions that suggested she was waiting for anything in return. She moved the same way she always had, but not quite. There was something steadier now, something grounded, and that difference, though small, stood out more than any display of wealth or influence happening around her. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the glass, his expression tightening just a fraction, because this was not how the outcome was supposed to feel. The test had been designed to reveal patterns, to confirm beliefs, but instead, it was creating questions he could not answer with numbers alone. Downstairs, the room continued to move, conversations rising and falling, attention shifting from one person to another, but slowly, almost without intention, the focus began to drift, not toward the loudest voices, but toward the quietest presence. It started with a glance, then another, small, subtle, as if people were trying to understand something they had not noticed before. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice cutting gently through the noise. "You have not used your card," she said. Not accusing, not curious, just stating a fact. Lily stopped, turning slightly, meeting her gaze for the first time directly. "I have," she replied, her tone even, and for a moment, the room stilled just enough for the words to register. Vanessa's expression shifted, interest sharpening. Chloe lowered her phone, attention caught. "Really?" Vanessa asked, a hint of disbelief threading through her voice. "And what exactly did you buy?" The question hung there, simple, direct, but carrying an undercurrent of expectation, as if the answer would confirm something they already believed. Lily held their gaze for a second longer, then looked down briefly, not in hesitation, but in consideration. "I paid a bill," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to confuse more than it clarified. Vanessa let out a small laugh, dismissive. "A bill?" she repeated. "With that?" Chloe's brows furrowed slightly, trying to piece it together. Rachel remained still, watching closely, and above them, Ethan Cole did not move at all, his attention fixed entirely on the woman who had just answered without revealing everything. Because in that moment, he understood something that none of the others did yet, that the most important part of her choice was not what she had said, but what she had not. The room did not erupt, it did not laugh, it did not dismiss her outright. Instead it paused, just long enough for the weight of her answer to settle into something uncomfortable, something unclear. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her expression caught between amusement and disbelief. "A bill," she repeated again, slower this time, as if saying it twice might reveal something more interesting, but it did not. It remained exactly what it was, simple, direct, almost ordinary. Chloe shifted her weight, her fingers hovering above her phone but no longer typing, her mind trying to translate the answer into something that could fit into her understanding of value, content, visibility, but it did not translate easily. Rachel's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in judgment, but in focus, because unlike the others, she was not reacting to what Lily had said, she was analyzing what it implied. A full bill, with no return, no leverage, no visible gain. It was not inefficient, it was intentional. An intention like that was not random. Lily stood there quietly, the tray now resting against her hip, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged. She had not offered more because there was nothing more she felt the need to explain. The choice had already been made, and explaining it would not change its meaning. Above them, Ethan Cole remained still behind the glass, his gaze fixed, his attention no longer divided between screens and data, but fully present in this moment. Because this was where the test shifted from numbers to truth, and truth rarely arrived with noise. It arrived like this, quiet, almost overlooked, but impossible to ignore once it settled. Vanessa took a step closer, her heels soft against the floor, her curiosity now edged with something sharper. "And that is it?" she asked, her voice light but probing. "You had unlimited access, and you chose that?" Chloe let out a small breath, half laugh, half confusion. "That is not even a strategy," she added, shaking her head slightly. "You could have done something bigger, something that actually changes your life." Rachel remained silent, but her gaze did not leave Lily. Waiting, measuring, Lily met Vanessa's eyes again, steady, unflinching. "It did change something," she said, her voice calm, and for a brief second, the room shifted again. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no defensiveness, no need to justify, just certainty. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly, the kind that appeared when someone did not get the reaction they expected. "I suppose that depends on what you think matters," she replied. Turning slightly as if to dismiss the conversation, Chloe nodded quickly, already ready to move on, to return to something that made more sense to her, something she could frame, something she could measure. But Rachel did not move. "Who was it for?" she asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes intent, because that was the missing piece, the one variable that could explain the decision. Lily hesitated for the first time, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice, because this was not about the person, not about the story behind it. It was about the action itself, someone who needed it, she answered simply. And that was all, no details, no names, no attempt to make it larger than it was, just the truth, stripped of everything unnecessary, above them. Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the railing, not in tension, but in recognition, because this was the part that did not fit into any model he had built, not just the action, but the refusal to turn it into something more. Most people, when they did something good, found a way to make it visible, to attach it to their identity, to gain something from it, even if that something was just acknowledgement. But Lily had done the opposite. She had removed herself from it completely, and in doing so, she had made the action itself the only thing that mattered. And that was something Ethan had not accounted for. Downstairs, the moment began to dissolve. Conversations picking back up, attention shifting away, but not entirely, because something had been introduced into the room that could not be easily dismissed, a question without a clear answer, a contrast that did not resolve itself neatly. Vanessa returned to her story, Chloe to her phone, Rachel to her thoughts, but each of them carried something new now, a quiet awareness that the test was not as simple as they had assumed, and Lily moved again, stepping away from the center of the room, back into the rhythm of her work, her presence once again blending into the background, but not quite the same as before, because even though the room had moved on, something had stayed behind, something that lingered just beneath the surface. And above it all, Ethan Cole stood watching, his reflection faint in the glass, his certainty no longer as solid as it had been. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about who had passed his test. He was thinking about whether the test itself had been wrong all along. That afternoon did not return to normal, even if it tried, even if the conversations resumed and the laughter filled the room again. Something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood, or at least partially understood. Vanessa found herself repeating her story again, but this time the reaction was not exactly the same. The admiration was still there, but it felt thinner, less certain, as if something had diluted it. Chloe continued to check her phone, her numbers still climbing, but even that did not feel as satisfying as it had earlier, because now there was a comparison she had not planned for, something she could not quantify. Rachel remained thoughtful, quieter than before, her mind no longer focused solely on outcomes, but on motives, on the unseen factors that shaped decisions. And across the room, Lily continued her work, her movements steady, unaffected on the surface, but the space around her carried a different weight now, not attention exactly, but awareness, the kind that lingers without being acknowledged. Upstairs, Ethan Cole stepped away from the glass for the first time in hours, his reflection disappearing as he moved deeper into the room. The screens behind him still active, still tracking, but no longer holding his full attention. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if each step required more thought than usual, because the framework he had relied on for years, the one that told him people were predictable when given power, that framework had just been challenged in a way he could not easily dismiss. He stopped near his desk, resting his hand lightly against its surface, his mind replaying the moment again, not the transaction itself, but the way Lily had spoken about it, the absence of explanation, the lack of performance, the quiet certainty. And for the first time, Ethan found himself asking a question he had not asked in a long time. Not what someone did, but why they did it without needing to be seen. That question stayed with him as he turned, his gaze shifting toward the door, toward the space beyond the glass where everything was unfolding. And then, without announcing it, without signaling his intent, he made a decision. He stepped out, the door opening with a soft sound that barely registered in the room below, but his presence did. Immediately, conversation slowed, then stopped, attention shifting instinctively, because when Ethan Cole entered a space, the space adjusted. Vanessa straightened slightly, Chloe lowered her phone, Rachel turned fully, and Lily simply paused, her hands still for a moment before she set the tray down carefully, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. Ethan did not speak right away. He walked into the center of the room, his gaze moving across each of them, taking in not just their appearances, but their energy, their reactions, the way they held themselves now compared to before. And then his eyes settled on Lily, not for long, but long enough to make it clear that something had shifted. "We are meeting earlier than planned," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but carrying a weight that silenced any remaining conversation. "I have seen enough." Vanessa's lips curved into a confident smile. Chloe's eyes lit up slightly. Rachel's expression sharpened, each of them interpreting the statement through their own expectations, through the results they believed they had achieved. But Ethan did not look at them as he continued. "This was never about how much you could spend," he said, his tone steady. "It was about what you would choose when nothing was stopping you." The words settled into the room, heavier than before, because now they carried context, now they carried implication. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly, her confidence still intact. "Then I believe the results speak for themselves," she said. Chloe nodded subtly, ready to align herself with whatever outcome followed. Rachel remained still, waiting, because she understood that the conclusion had not yet been revealed. And then, Ethan shifted his gaze again, this time directly to Lily, his expression unreadable, but his focus unmistakable. "And sometimes," he added, "what is not shown matters more than what is." The room fell completely silent then, not out of confusion, but out of anticipation, because something was about to be said, something that would define everything that had come before it. But Ethan paused, just for a moment, not to create tension, but because he was choosing his words carefully, because this was no longer just a test, it was a realization. And as he stood there, looking at the four women in front of him, but truly seeing only one of them clearly, he understood something that had taken him years to forget and only 48 hours to remember. That value was not revealed by how loudly it could be displayed, but by how quietly it could exist. And as that understanding settled into place, the outcome of the test was no longer a question of who had done the most, but who had needed the least to prove anything at all. No one spoke immediately after his last words settled into the room, not because they did not understand, but because they were still trying to decide what it meant for them. Vanessa was the first to recover, her posture straightening as her confidence returned to the surface. With all due respect, she began, her tone polished, controlled. This was about making an impact, and I believe I did exactly that. She gestured lightly toward herself, toward the visible results of her choices, the presence she had built in just 48 hours. Chloe stepped in quickly, aligning herself with the same logic. Visibility matters, she added. Influence creates opportunities, and opportunities create change. Her words carefully chosen, shaped to sound both strategic and meaningful. Rachel did not interrupt, but her gaze shifted between Ethan and Lily, her expression thoughtful, as if she was waiting for something deeper to be revealed, something that had not yet been said. Ethan listened without reacting, his face calm, unreadable, but his silence was not passive, it was deliberate, because he was not weighing their arguments. He had already seen their choices, already understood the patterns behind them, and now, those patterns felt incomplete. Impact, he repeated finally, his voice quiet but clear, is not always measured by how many people see it. The statement hung in the air, simple, but heavy. Vanessa's smile tightened again. Chloe's expression flickered with uncertainty. Rachel's eyes sharpened slightly, and Lily remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence steady, not defensive, not expectant, just present. Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the group, his gaze moving briefly across the three women who had spoken, acknowledging them without validating their conclusions, and then he turned fully toward Lily, not as an afterthought, but as the center of his attention. "You paid a bill," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Lily met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm, and for a moment, the simplicity of that exchange seemed to deepen the silence rather than break it. Vanessa let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "That still does not explain why that matters more than what the rest of us did," she said. Her tone edged now, no longer just confident, but slightly defensive. Chloe nodded quickly, her agreement immediate. Rachel remained quiet, but her focus did not waver. Ethan did not look away from Lily as he responded. "It matters because she did not need it to be seen," he said, his voice steady. And that was the moment the room shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that could be felt. Because the distinction he had just drawn was not about the action itself, it was about the intention behind it. Vanessa's brows drew together slightly. Chloe's lips parted as if to respond, but then closed again. Rachel's expression softened just a fraction, as if something had clicked into place. Lily did not react outwardly, but something in her posture settled even further, as if the truth of what she had done had finally been acknowledged without needing her to explain it. Ethan turned then, walking slowly toward the glass wall. Not to leave, but to shift the space, to change the angle of the conversation, the city stretching out behind him again, vast and indifferent. "I created this test because I believe that when people are given unlimited access, they reveal their priorities," he said, his back partially turned, his voice carrying evenly through the room. "And I was right." He paused briefly, then added, "But I was incomplete." The admission was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it was not directed at them, it was directed at himself. Vanessa's confidence faltered slightly, Chloe's expression tightened, Rachel's eyes widened just a fraction, and Lily simply listened, because this was not about her anymore. This was about something larger, something shifting beyond the scope of the test itself. Ethan turned back to face them, his gaze steady, but no longer distant. What you choose when nothing is stopping you reveals what you value, he continued. But what you choose when no one is watching reveals who you are. The words landed fully now, not as a statement, but as a realization, and in that moment, the difference between them became undeniable, not because of what had been done, but because of why it had been done. Vanessa looked away briefly. Chloe lowered her phone completely. Rachel exhaled slowly, and Lily stood where she was, unchanged, because she had never been trying to prove anything in the first place. Ethan let the silence hold for a moment longer, not to create tension, but to allow the truth of what he had said to settle. And then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but more certain than before. This was never about finding the best result, he said. It was about finding the truest one. And as those words filled the room, the outcome of the test became clear. Not through announcement, not through declaration, but through understanding, because in a room filled with choices that had been designed to impress, only one had been made without needing to be seen at all, and that was the one that changed everything. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something settling into place after being moved too far for too long. Vanessa was the first to look away, not out of defeat, but out of discomfort, because the confidence she had carried into the room no longer had the same foundation beneath it. Chloe glanced down at her phone, but did not unlock it, as if even the numbers that had once excited her now felt disconnected from what had just been said. Rachel stood still, her posture unchanged, but her expression different, more reflective, as if she was recalculating something that could not be measured in percentages. And Lily remained where she was, quiet, grounded, unchanged in a way that now felt more significant than ever. Ethan Cole did not rush to fill the space. He allowed the weight of the moment to linger, because this was not a conclusion that needed to be announced loudly. It needed to be understood, and understanding required silence. So what happens now? Vanessa asked finally, her voice softer than before, the sharp edge replaced with something closer to uncertainty. Ethan turned his gaze toward her, not dismissive, not confrontational, just steady. Now, he said, we stop pretending this was a competition. The words landed gently, but they carried a clear shift in direction. Chloe's brows furrowed slightly. Then what was it? She asked, her tone no longer confident, but searching. Ethan took a slow breath, his eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to the group. It was a reflection, he said. Not of what you can do with money, but of what you believe money is for. Rachel nodded almost imperceptibly, as if the statement aligned with something she had already begun to understand. Vanessa crossed her arms again, but this time it was not a gesture of control, it was a way to steady herself. And you believe that one answer is better than the others? She asked, not challenging, but genuinely asking. Ethan considered the question for a moment, then shook his head slightly. No, he said. I believe one answer was more honest. The distinction settled into the room, subtle but important, because it was no longer about right or wrong. It was about alignment between action and intention, and in that space, only one choice had remained consistent without needing validation. Ethan stepped forward again, his attention returning to Lily, but this time, it was not observational, it was direct, intentional. You did not ask for recognition, he said. You did not try to explain your choice, and you did not change your behavior afterward. Lily met his gaze, her expression calm, her voice steady when she responded. There was nothing to explain, she said, and the simplicity of that answer carried more clarity than any detailed justification could have. Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but one that carried meaning, because in that moment, he was not evaluating her. He was learning from her, something he had not expected when this began. Vanessa shifted her weight, glancing briefly toward Lily. Her expression no longer dismissive, but thoughtful, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Chloe exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering slightly, the tension she had been carrying dissolving into something less defined. Rachel finally spoke, her voice measured. Then the outcome is not about who did the most, she said. It is about who needed the least to prove something. Ethan looked at her, a faint recognition in his expression. Exactly, he replied, and that was the moment. Everything aligned, not through declaration, but through understanding, because the test had never been about the scale of the action. It had been about the absence of performance within it. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving once more across the room, taking in each of them, not as competitors, but as individuals who had revealed something true about themselves. And then he made a decision, not impulsively, but with a clarity that had not been there before. "This does not end here," he said, his voice steady. "Because what I have seen is not something that should be observed once and forgotten." Vanessa looked at him, her curiosity returning, but now it was grounded in something different. Chloe lifted her head slightly, attentive again. Rachel focused fully, and Lily simply listened, her presence unchanged. Ethan continued. "I built systems to measure value," he said. "But I realize now that some things cannot be measured the way I have been measuring them." He paused briefly, then added, "And that means the system needs to change." The statement was not dramatic, but it carried weight, because it was not about them anymore. It was about something larger, something that extended beyond the room, beyond the test. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if about to speak, but she did not. Chloe's grip on her phone loosened, Rachel's expression softened, and Lily stood there, steady as ever, because for her, nothing had changed. She had made her choice without expecting anything in return, and whatever followed was not something she had been waiting for. Ethan took one final step forward, his gaze resting on her again, not as an observer, but as someone who had just been shown something he could not ignore. And in that moment, the test that had begun as a way to confirm what he believed about people had become something entirely different. It had revealed something about him, something he could no longer overlook. And as the room held that realization together, the next step was no longer about judgment. It was about what he would do with what he had finally learned. The room did not feel the same anymore, not because anything physical had changed, but because the meaning behind everything had shifted. The space that once carried quiet competition now held something more reflective, more grounded. Vanessa no longer stood at the center of attention the way she had earlier, her posture still elegant, still composed, but her confidence now tempered by something she had not expected to confront. The realization that visibility did not always equal value. Chloe remained still for a moment longer than usual, her phone resting at her side instead of in front of her. Her thoughts no longer focused on numbers or reactions, but on something less tangible, something she could not track or post. Rachel stood with her usual composure, but her eyes were different now, sharper, not with calculation, but with understanding, because she had recognized the shift before the others. And now she was watching how it would unfold, and Lily, as always, remained unchanged on the surface, her presence quiet, steady, but now impossible to overlook in the way it had been before. Ethan Cole stood in front of them, no longer observing from a distance, no longer separating himself from the moment, because this was no longer about analysis, it was about action, and action required presence. "I built this company on the idea that value can be measured," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a new depth that had not been there before. "Profit, growth, influence, these are things I understand. Things I can control." He paused briefly, his gaze shifting toward the window, and then back again. "But what I saw in the last 48 hours, that is something I cannot measure the same way." The words settled into the room, not as a weakness, but as an acknowledgement, something that required strength to admit. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. Chloe's attention remained fixed, Rachel's posture straightened slightly, and Lily simply stood, as she always had, grounded in something that did not need to be explained. Ethan took a step closer, his focus now clear, deliberate. "So I am changing something," he continued. "Not the test, but what comes after it." The statement shifted the energy again, curiosity rising, not out of competition, but out of genuine interest. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Changing what exactly?" she asked, her tone no longer defensive, but open. Ethan met her gaze briefly before answering. "What we invest in," he said, then turned slightly, allowing his words to reach all of them. "I have spent years investing in ideas that promise return, growth, visibility," he continued. "But I have ignored something just as important, intention." Rachel nodded slowly, as if the word itself confirmed what she had been thinking. Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to understand where this was leading, and Lily remained still, listening, because whatever was coming next was not something she had been expecting. Ethan's voice softened just slightly, not losing strength, but gaining clarity. "I am creating a new foundation," he said. "One that does not just fund projects that look good on paper, but supports actions that are done without needing to be seen." The room held that idea carefully, as if testing its weight. Vanessa's brows lifted slightly, Chloe shifted her stance, Rachel leaned in just a fraction, and Lily's expression remained calm, though something subtle moved beneath it, something not quite visible. Ethan continued, "And I want someone who understands that kind of value to help build it." His gaze moved then, directly to Lily, not as a possibility, but as a decision already made. "You," he said simply, the word landing without decoration, without hesitation, just certainty. The room stilled again, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because even if they had not expected it, it made sense in a way that could not be argued. Vanessa did not protest, Chloe did not react with disbelief, Rachel did not question it, because the outcome was no longer about preference, it was about alignment. Lily blinked once, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, but her eyes held something new now, not surprise, not excitement, but a quiet consideration, because this was not something she had asked for, not something she had worked toward. It was something that had arrived because of who she had been when no one was watching. "I do not have experience with that kind of work," she said after a moment, her voice honest, not hesitant, just clear. Ethan nodded slightly. "You have something more important," he replied. "You understand why it matters." The answer was simple, but it carried weight, because it reframed everything. It shifted the focus from qualifications to character, from experience to intention, and in that shift, the decision became complete. Vanessa exhaled softly, a small smile forming, not of defeat, but of understanding. Chloe lowered her gaze briefly, thoughtful. Rachel allowed herself the smallest nod, and Lily stood there, holding the moment not as a reward, but as a responsibility, because she understood something that the others were only beginning to realize, that what had been given to her was not about what she had done, but about what she would do next. And as Ethan Cole watched her, no longer as a subject of a test, but as someone who had just changed the direction of his thinking, he realized that the most valuable outcome of the last 48 hours was not the answer he had found, but the question he would never stop asking again. The moment did not explode into celebration. It settled instead, quiet and steady, like something finding its place after being uncertain for too long. Lily did not step forward immediately. She did not react the way someone might expect when being offered something that could change the course of her life. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if she was measuring the weight of what had just been placed in front of her, not as an opportunity, but as a responsibility. Vanessa watched her closely now, no longer with judgment, but with curiosity, the kind that comes when assumptions begin to fall apart. Chloe shifted her stance again, her phone still lowered, her attention fully present in a way it had not been before. Rachel remained composed, but there was a quiet approval in her expression, a recognition that what was happening was not just a decision, but a correction. Ethan Cole did not rush her, he did not fill the silence with explanation or persuasion, because he understood that whatever answer she gave would not come from pressure. It would come from the same place her previous decision had come from, a place that did not need an audience. "Why me?" Lily asked finally, her voice calm, not doubtful, not overwhelmed, just direct, the question simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Because you did not try to be chosen," he said, and the truth of that answer settled immediately, because it was not about her action alone. It was about the absence of intention behind it. She had not been trying to win. She had not been trying to prove anything. She had simply acted in alignment with something deeper, something consistent. Lily held his gaze for a moment longer, considering not just his words, but what they meant beyond the surface. This was not an offer built on performance. It was not something she had earned through strategy or visibility. It was something that had found her because of who she had been when no one was watching, and that made it different. That made it something she could not take lightly. "And if I say no?" she asked, not as a rejection, but as a question that needed to be understood. Because acceptance without understanding would not align with the way she made decisions. Ethan nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. Then nothing changes, he replied. Except that I will know I was right about you. The answer did not push. It did not persuade. It simply allowed her the space to choose freely, the same space he had given her at the beginning of the test. Vanessa exhaled softly, almost a quiet laugh, shaking her head just slightly as if acknowledging something she had not expected to witness. Chloe's eyes flicked between them, trying to process the exchange. Rachel remained still, her focus unwavering, because she understood that this was the real decision, not the one made with the card, but the one being made now. Lily looked down briefly, not out of uncertainty, but to center herself, to return to the same place she had been when she made her previous choice, a place where the noise of expectation did not reach, where the outcome did not define the action. And when she looked back up, her expression was the same, steady, grounded, clear. I will do it, she said, her voice quiet, but certain, not because of what she would gain, but because of what she believed she could give. And in that moment, the decision felt complete, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just right. Ethan allowed himself a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because he understood that her acceptance was not a reaction. It was a continuation of who she already was. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly, but this time there was a faint smile on her face, not of superiority, but of recognition. Chloe finally slipped her phone into her bag, as if letting go of something she no longer needed in that moment. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her voice calm. Then it begins now, she said, and there was no need for further explanation, because they all understood that what had just been created was not just a position. It was a shift, a change in direction, not just for Ethan, but for everything that would come after. Lily did not move toward the center of the room. She did not step into a spotlight. She simply stood where she was, because the role she had accepted was not about being seen. It was about what she would do when she was not. And that understanding settled into the space in a way that did not need to be spoken. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room one last time, taking in each of them, not as participants in a test, but as witnesses to something that had changed more than any of them had expected. We start tomorrow, he said, his voice steady, but carrying a new sense of direction. And as the words left him, the room no longer felt like a place where something had ended. It felt like a place where something had just begun, something quieter, something deeper, something that would not be measured in numbers or visibility, but in the kind of impact that did not need to be seen to exist. And as Lily Carter stood there, no longer invisible, but not seeking to be visible either, she understood that the choice she had made with a single card had not just changed someone else's life. It had just changed the way an entire system would begin to see value. 1 year later, the city looked the same from the outside, the same skyline stretching into the distance, the same rhythm of movement and noise. But inside the glass tower that once held a simple test, something had changed in ways that could not be seen from the street. The executive floor no longer carried the same quiet tension of competition. It carried purpose, a different kind of energy, one that moved slower but reached deeper. The foundation that had once been just an idea now existed. In action, not in headlines or campaigns, but in quiet decisions made every day. Lily Carter stood near a large window, a folder in her hands, her reflection faint against the city beyond, her posture the same as it had always been, steady, grounded. But now her presence filled the room in a way that no one could overlook, not because she demanded attention, but because she did not need to. On the table behind her lay a series of reports, not filled with projections or profit margins, but with stories, real ones, people whose lives had shifted in ways that could not be measured in numbers alone. Hospital bills cleared, homes stabilized, opportunities created where there had been none, each decision made without cameras, without announcements, just action. Rachel stood across from her, reviewing the documents with a quiet focus. Her role had evolved as well, not away from strategy, but towards something more balanced, where logic and intention worked together instead of against each other. Vanessa leaned against the edge of the table, no longer dressed to impress, but to move, to work, her confidence still there, but reshaped into something less performative, more grounded. Chloe sat nearby, her phone still part of her life, but no longer the center of it. She had shifted her platform, using it not to showcase herself, but to highlight stories that would otherwise remain unseen. And at the head of the room, Ethan Cole stood watching, not as the one in control, but as someone who had chosen to step back just enough to see clearly. His expression calmer now, less guarded, as if something he had been holding on to for years had finally been set down. This one, Rachel said, sliding a file forward, requires immediate attention. Lily nodded, stepping closer, her eyes scanning the details, her focus sharp, not because she had learned it from experience, but because she had always known how to recognize what mattered. "We will handle it today," she said, her voice quiet but certain, and there was no hesitation in it, no need for approval, because the system they had built did not require layers of validation to do what was right. It required trust, and that trust had been placed in her for a reason. Ethan watched the exchange, the simplicity of it, the clarity, and for a moment, his mind returned to the beginning, to the black card, to the empty column on the screen, to the choice that had not been made for recognition, but for something deeper, something that could not be programmed or predicted. And he realized that what had changed was not just the direction of his company. It was the way he saw value itself, not as something to be extracted, but as something to be understood. "Do you ever think about that day?" Chloe asked suddenly, her voice softer now, less performative, more genuine. Lily paused for a moment, her gaze lifting slightly as she considered the question, not searching for an answer, but reflecting on something that no longer felt distant. "Not the way I used to," she replied. And there was a quiet truth in that, because the moment that had once felt like a decision now felt like a beginning. Vanessa smiled faintly, shaking her head just slightly. "I still cannot believe you chose that," she said, but there was no judgment in her voice, only admiration. Rachel closed the folder in front of her, her attention shifting briefly toward Lily. "It was not about the choice," she said. "It was about who made it." Ethan stepped forward then, his presence still commanding, but no longer distant. "And what it revealed," he added, his voice steady. And the room settled into that understanding again, not as something new, but as something that had been proven over time, something that had grown stronger with every quiet decision that followed. Lily looked down at the folder in her hands once more, then back up, her expression unchanged, because for her, nothing about this was extraordinary. It was simply the continuation of a way of being that had never needed validation to exist. "We should go," she said, her tone practical, grounded, and the others nodded, moving with her, not behind her, not ahead of her, but alongside, because what had been created was not a hierarchy, it was alignment. And as they stepped out of the room together, the city beyond the glass continued to move, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside, unaware that somewhere within its endless motion, a different kind of value was now being recognized, one that did not rely on attention to exist. And as Ethan Cole watched them leave, a quiet realization settled fully into place. The most powerful thing he had discovered was not how people behave when given everything, but how one person chose to give something away when no one was asking. And that was the kind of truth that no system could ever replace.